Stop right there. Everything you learned about July 4th is a beautiful, patriotic lie. You've been taught a fairy tale, but for the next hour, we are exposing the terrifying secret history of the Declaration of Independence. You will discover the exact date the founders committed treason, the shocking reason they replaced property with the pursuit of happiness, and the one crucial sentence about slavery they deliberately erased to save their own skins. This is the unvarnished truth about the 56 men who signed their death warrants. This story isn't just history, it's the hidden key to understanding the American creed. You need to know this truth. So, let the story begin. The summer of 1776 was a sweat-soaked, fly-infested crucible in Philadelphia, where the heat was not only meteorological but political. The stench of stale beer, horse manure, and unwashed bodies hung heavy in the humid air of the State House, later to be renamed Independence Hall. Inside the Second Continental Congress, 56 men of varying talent, temperament, and sheer courage wrestled daily with a question that, if answered incorrectly, would lead them all to the gallows. They were traitors. They knew it. Every debate, every whispered conversation in the city tavern, every scratch of a quill on parchment was an act of high treason against King George III. They were not merely debating taxes or trade. They were debating death. The Virginians' Resolution. July 2nd's true firework. The date most Americans remember is July 4th. The true, terrifying moment of no return, however, happened 2 days earlier. It began with Richard Henry Lee of Virginia, a lanky, passionate orator with a sharp mind and an even sharper nose. Lee had been pushing for outright separation for months. He was the man who, on June 7, 1776, stood before the Congress and introduced his fateful motion, often called the Lee Resolution. Resolved that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. The resolution was a thunderclap. It forced the issue. For weeks the delegates debated, their voices rising and falling in the sweltering heat. Men like John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, though a patriot, argued desperately for caution, for one last humble appeal to the king. The war was already raging, Lexington, Concord, Bunker Hill, but a full declaration of independence, Dickinson argued, would alienate potential European allies and invite utter destruction upon their fledgling armies. Against him stood John Adams of Massachusetts, a man short in stature but volcanic in temper, and now the absolute, relentless champion of independence. Adams, writing to his wife Abigail, famously described the debate as the greatest debate ever held in America. He was the engine of the revolution in that room, tireless, argumentative, and ultimately persuasive. The astonishment lies in the final vote. On July 2nd, 1776, 12 colonies voted in favor of Lee's resolution. New York abstained, lacking the immediate instructions to vote yes, but the result was unanimous among those who voted. John Adams was ecstatic. He immediately wrote to Abigail, predicting that the 2nd of July would be celebrated by future generations with pomp and parade, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other. He was right about the celebration, but he was off by 2 days. The momentous, definitive act of separation was sealed on the 2nd. The penman of the age, a quiet genius. Meanwhile, a quiet red-haired Virginian sat in a small rented room at the house of a bricklayer named Jacob Graff, working on an entirely different document. Thomas Jefferson was only 33. He was not a fiery orator like Adams, nor a revered sage like Franklin. In fact, he rarely spoke in Congress, yet he possessed the most gifted pen of the Revolutionary generation. On June 11th, Congress had appointed a committee of 5 to draft a formal statement justifying the separation, a declaration to the world. The members were John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, Robert Livingston, and Thomas Jefferson. Adams knew his own bombastic style might alienate some. Franklin, witty and wise, was too busy being the elder statesman and had too many letters to write. Both men deferred to Jefferson. The task of writing the document that would define American identity fell to the reserved scholar, who, astonishingly, was more concerned with the intellectual and philosophical underpinnings of liberty than the immediate political maneuvering. Jefferson, perched at a portable writing desk of his own design, composed the draft over 17 days. He aimed not for originality. His goal was to articulate the common sense of the subject in terms so plain and firm as to command their assent. He drew heavily from the language of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, written by his friend George Mason, and from the Enlightenment philosophies of John Locke and others. The astonishing part is the sheer audacity of the opening sentence. When, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another. This was not a humble petition. It was a philosophical justification for revolution. But then came the immortal, electrifying phrase that became the very DNA of America. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This was the American creed, born in a stifling room, written by a young man who owned human beings, yet articulated a universal aspiration that would haunt and challenge the nation for centuries to come. The slicing and dicing, the committee of the whole. Jefferson submitted his initial draft. It was a masterpiece, but it was not perfect, not politically at least. From July 2nd to July 4th, the Congress, acting as the Committee of the Whole, tore into it. The delegates, driven by urgency and self-preservation, edited Thomas Jefferson's work for 2 days. John Adams was his draft's tenacious defender, but even he could not prevent some agonizing excisions. The delegates made 86 revisions in total. The most famous and politically necessary deletion was a passage known as the vehement Philippic against the king. In it, Jefferson condemned King George III for perpetuating the slave trade, calling it a cruel war against human nature itself, and accusing the king of imposing slavery upon the colonists. The delegates from South Carolina and Georgia, whose economies were utterly dependent on the institution of slavery, objected immediately and fiercely. New England delegates, whose merchants had built fortunes on the transatlantic slave trade, were also uncomfortable. The passage was struck.
This is the astonishing paradox at the heart of the Declaration. The phrase, "all men are created equal," was adopted simultaneously with the removal of the clause that condemned the very institution of inequality. The founders chose political unity over moral consistency, securing their liberty while tragically deferring the question of another's freedom. July 4th, 1776. The ink dries, the bell rings. The sun rose on July 4th, 1776, finding the delegates still working, still arguing, still slicing away at Jefferson's text. Finally, in the late afternoon, the Continental Congress voted to approve the final, edited document. The document approved that day was not the famous signed parchment hanging in the National Archives. It was merely the text, approved and authorized for immediate distribution. Charles Thomson, the Secretary of Congress, officially attested the document, and John Hancock, the President of Congress, signed it with his famously bold, flamboyant signature, allegedly so that George III may read it without spectacles. That night, printer John Dunlap worked feverishly to set the type. By dawn on July 5, 1776, the first printed copies, known as the Dunlap broadsides, were being distributed. These broadsides, bearing only the names of Hancock and Thomson, with a true, immediate declaration to the world. A local newspaper, the Pennsylvania Evening Post, published the news first on July 6th. The famous story of the Liberty Bell ringing out wildly on the 4th is more legend than fact. While there was a ringing on the 8th of July, when the Declaration was first publicly read to the citizens in the State House yard, the mood on the 4th was one of stunned, nervous relief, not celebratory fireworks. These men had just officially signed their own death warrants. They were no longer fighting for reconciliation. They were fighting for their lives. Part 2. The risk of the signature. The real existential drama of the Declaration was not the writing, but the signing. The document approved on July 4th was merely a text. It wasn't until weeks later that the famous engrossed copy, the beautiful official parchment copy, was created for the delegates to affix their names. The signing ceremony, often depicted in heroic paintings as a grand event on July 4th, actually occurred primarily on August 2nd, 1776. This act was the most astonishing display of collective courage, or collective insanity, in American history. They signed not just a document, but a commitment to hang together, or, assuredly, hang separately. The price on their heads. The delegates knew the British view of their work. They were rebels. The king's response would be simple. If captured, they would be hanged, drawn, and quartered for treason. Consider the risk. Military defeat. At the time of the signing, the military outlook was grim. George Washington had just suffered severe setbacks in New York. The might of the British Army and Navy was descending upon them. Financial ruin. Many signers were wealthy men. By signing, they put their entire fortunes, their homes, lands, and businesses at risk of confiscation by the Crown. 9 of the signers were later captured by the British. At least 5 had their homes ransacked or destroyed. Personal sacrifice. Francis Lewis of New York lost his wife to British captivity, where she was cruelly treated. John Hart of New Jersey, the Speaker of the Colonial Assembly, was driven from his sick wife's bedside. His house was ransacked, and he was forced to hide in forests and caves. This profound personal sacrifice underscores the most astonishing and often forgotten truth of the Declaration. It was less a guarantee of freedom and more a declaration of unshakable faith in an uncertain future. They did not sign a finished product. They signed an application for war. The narrative would continue from here, detailing the lives and sacrifices of key signers, the military reality after the signing, the Declaration's slow journey across the states, its diplomatic impact in Europe, especially in securing the vital French alliance, its forgotten influence on early American state constitutions, and its transformation from a political document into the ultimate American ideal. The story of its physical preservation, its hidden moves during wartime, and its rediscovery as the nation's parchment idol would fill the remaining tens of thousands of words, focusing on factual, astonishing details of courage, failure, and the ultimate triumph of an idea.
Part 3. The Price of the Pledge and the Lure of Paris. The drama did not end with the August 2nd signing. The signatures were not merely ink on parchment, they were bonds in blood, a solemn and suicidal mutual pledge of our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. The British, now fully aware that the colonists were not merely protesting but establishing a new nation, began to execute the penalties of treason with ruthless efficiency. The signers pay the reckoning. The true, astonishing fact of the Declaration is the sheer number of men who paid a heavy, direct price for their convictions, transforming their political act into a profound, personal sacrifice. Richard Stockton of New Jersey was a wealthy judge and plantation owner. Just months after signing, he was captured by a loyalist militia and turned over to the British. His imprisonment was harrowing. He was starved, denied bedding, and deliberately poisoned with tainted food. His magnificent estate, Morven, was looted, and his extensive library, one of the finest in the colonies, was burned. The psychological and physical toll broke him. Though eventually paroled, he died in 1781, ruined in health and fortune. He was the only signer imprisoned explicitly for the act of signing. Francis Lewis of New York, a merchant born in Wales, endured one of the most agonizing family tragedies. The British captured his wife, Elizabeth, and imprisoned her in a vile prison, where she was subjected to cruel treatment and deprivation. The ordeal destroyed her health, and she died shortly after her release, a martyr to her husband's commitment to liberty. Francis Lewis also saw his home and all his property destroyed. Carter Braxton of Virginia, one of the wealthiest men in the colonies, was a shipping magnate. The British Navy systematically hunted down and destroyed his fleet of merchant vessels. He lost his entire fortune and was forced to sell his estates to satisfy his creditors, dying in financial distress. Thomas Nelson, Jr. of Virginia demonstrated an extraordinary act of self-sacrifice at the siege of Yorktown. When General Washington asked him to point out the best place to concentrate American and French artillery fire on the British forces, Nelson directed the guns toward the largest, most formidable house in the area, his own family mansion, which he believed was serving as General Cornwallis's headquarters. He sacrificed his immense property to ensure the final victory of the Revolution. The narrative of the 56 signers is not one of flawless heroism, but of profound stakes. They risked everything, their security, their families, and their lives, not for a guaranteed reward, but for an idea articulated in the Declaration. The astonishing lure of Paris, Franklin's diplomatic masquerade. The most immediate and critical objective following the Declaration was not military victory, but diplomatic recognition, specifically from France. The colonists possessed a righteous cause, but they lacked money, arms, gunpowder, uniforms, and a navy. The King of France, Louis XVI, held the key to all these necessities. To secure this vital, high-stakes alliance, Congress dispatched a commission to Paris. The man chosen to lead this mission was 70-year-old Benjamin Franklin, the ultimate American polymath, now transformed into America's chief diplomat. Franklin's arrival in Paris in December 1776 was an astonishing cultural phenomenon. He did not arrive as a formal ambassador, but as a private citizen. Yet he was already world famous, a scientist whose experiments with electricity were a sensation, a philosopher whose wisdom filled almanacs, and a simple republican symbol of the Enlightenment. He cultivated an image calculated to charm and seduce the sophisticated French aristocracy, while the other American envoys, dressed in the powdered wigs and silks appropriate for a royal court, Franklin wore a simple, unadorned brown velvet coat, spectacles, and, most famously, a fur cap, which he claimed was for his gout. This plain attire, this studied rusticity, was an act of profound political theater. The French court and public went mad for the bonhomme Franklin, the good man Franklin. His image was everywhere, on snuff boxes, rings, watches, and porcelain. A rage for all things American swept Paris. Franklin became the living embodiment of the virtuous, anti-monarchical ideals the French philosophes dreamed of. The Secret War of the Livre. The French foreign minister, the Comte de Vergennes, harbored a deep strategic goal: revenge for France's defeat by the British in the 7 Years' War. But officially recognizing the rebellious colonies was an act of war, and Louis XVI was hesitant. The astonishing truth is that France began aiding the Americans secretly long before the Declaration. Through a fictional Spanish-French trading company named Rodrigue Hortalez et Compagnie, managed by the playwright Pierre Beaumarchais, author of The Marriage of Figaro, the French royal treasury channeled millions of livres to the American rebels. This clandestine support provided 90% of the gunpowder used by the Americans in the crucial Battle of Saratoga, 25,000 muskets, and vast stores of clothing and tents. Without this initial, secret French aid, this covert support that predated formal alliance,
The American resistance, particularly George Washington's army in 1776 and 1777, would have certainly collapsed. The declaration would have been nothing more than a historical footnote of a failed rebellion. The triumph of Saratoga, the diplomatic coup. Franklin, the master diplomat, waited patiently, using his immense popularity to apply social pressure while the military situation remained uncertain. The breakthrough came in December 1777 with the astonishing news of the American victory at the Battle of Saratoga. This was the decisive military proof that the colonists could actually defeat a British army. Vergennes seized the opportunity. He feared that the British, suddenly chastened, might offer a peace deal to Franklin that would bring the colonists back into the empire, leaving France diplomatically isolated. On February 6, 1778, 2 years after the Lee Resolution, the two nations signed the Treaty of Alliance and the Treaty of Amity and Commerce. France became the first foreign power to officially recognize the United States as a sovereign nation, turning a colonial revolt into a global war. The Declaration, written to justify independence to the world, had finally achieved its primary diplomatic objective. It unlocked the treasures of the French crown, the navy, the troops, and the money that would ensure the ultimate astonishing victory at Yorktown 3 years later. The document's powerful words had been validated not by moral clarity, but by cannon and cash, secured by the greatest diplomat of his age.
Part 4. The Creed of Equality, from political weapon to moral stumbling block. The Declaration of Independence won the war, yet it faced an astonishing post-revolutionary decline. Once the immediate crisis of British tyranny was past and the Constitution was ratified in 1788, the American political center of gravity shifted. The Constitution, with its pragmatic compromises on slavery and taxation, became the revered text of law and government. The Declaration, by contrast, was relegated to the status of a mere state paper, a glorified war communique. The curious obscurity of the early republic. For decades after the Revolutionary War, the 4th of July was celebrated with pomp and circumstance, as Adams had predicted. But the focus was on the event of independence, not the document. The text ignored. Political debates centered on Hamiltonian finance, Jeffersonian democracy, and international neutrality, all issues governed by the Constitution. The phrase, "all men are created equal," was not the rallying cry of this period. The parchment forgotten. The physical document itself was moved around with almost casual disregard. It spent years in various federal buildings, subject to temperature and humidity fluctuations, often simply rolled up or folded. This negligence explains its tragic accelerated fading, a silent testament to its diminished political importance. Jefferson's silence. Even Thomas Jefferson, the author, did not actively promote the Declaration as a foundational text in his later years. He saw his work on the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom and his founding of the University of Virginia as equally, if not more important, to his legacy.
The Declaration only began its magnificent re-emergence in the 1820s and 1830s, fueled by two powerful contradictory forces: the democratic fervor of the Jacksonian era and the moral fire of the abolitionist movement. The Declaration as the Anti-Slavery Manifesto. The most astonishing twist in the story of the Declaration is its transformation into the central weapon used against the very system, slavery, that its original authors had protected with their political compromise in 1776. Abolitionists saw the phrase "all men are created equal" not as a reflection of the colonists' desire for equal status with Great Britain, but as a universal moral truth. They used the Declaration as a devastating indictment of American hypocrisy. Frederick Douglass's challenge. In 1852, the great orator and escaped slave Frederick Douglass delivered his electrifying address, "What to the slave is the 4th of July?" He used the Declaration as a moral mirror, reflecting America's darkest stain. He asked, are the great principles of political freedom and of natural justice embodied in that Declaration of Independence extended to us? He answered with a resounding no. Yet he did not reject the document. Instead, he argued that the Declaration contained the saving principles that could redeem the nation. The Seneca Falls Convention, 1848. The astonishing reach of the Declaration's creed was evident when the women's rights movement adopted it. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and the delegates at the first Women's Rights Convention drafted their Declaration of Sentiments, deliberately modeling its structure and language on Jefferson's text, starting with the iconic revision, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal." The document became a template for every marginalized group seeking rights within the Republic. Abraham Lincoln's apple of gold. By the 1850s, the Declaration was the heart of the national debate. Pro-slavery politicians like John C. Calhoun openly denounced the phrase, "all men are created equal," as the most false and dangerous of all political errors. In response, Abraham Lincoln, a self-made politician from Illinois, enshrined the Declaration as the foundation of his political philosophy. Lincoln described the Declaration as the apple of gold, the moral truth, within the picture of silver, which was the frame and the law. He argued that the founders included the equality clause for future use, as a goal to be constantly strived for, a stumbling block to all those who, in aftertimes, might seek to turn a free people back into the hateful paths of despotism. The Declaration of Independence was thus reinvented in the decades before the Civil War. It ceased being a mere document of separation and became the nation's moral compass, the promissory note of universal freedom that the Civil War would finally attempt to cash. The journey of the parchment, a relic on the run. While its text was igniting a moral revolution, the physical parchment document lived an equally astonishing, if far more humble life, as a relic in constant danger. The tragic facsimile, 1823. Due to poor handling, including the State Department leaving it unprotected near a window, and an early 19th century practice of making wet press copies. The ink on the original parchment was already fading badly. To combat this deterioration and satisfy public demand for a copy, Secretary of State John Quincy Adams commissioned engraver William J. Stone to create an exact facsimile on copperplate. The astonishing result of this meticulous 1823 engraving is that most Americans have seen Stone's copy, not the original. It preserved the look of the document just before its signatures became virtually illegible. The Wartime Hiding, 1876 and World War II. Fear for the relic's safety was a constant theme. During the Civil War, it was briefly housed in the Patent Office, a comparatively safe, fire-resistant building. Decades later, during World War II, the Declaration and the Constitution were secretly removed from Washington, D.C., and entrusted to the nation's deepest repository, the United States Bullion Depository at Fort Knox, Kentucky. Guarded by the Army, locked in a massive vault, the Declaration of Independence spent the war years alongside the nation's gold reserves, a symbol of freedom protected by the very wealth it helped to create. In 1952, the document finally found its ultimate, secure home in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. Today, it rests in a case filled with chemically inert helium gas and meticulously controlled for temperature and humidity. Guarded 24/7, it is no longer just a political document or a moral creed. It is a sacred relic, fragile, faded, but infinitely powerful.
Part 5. The Unfinished Revolution and the Global Echo. The Declaration of Independence entered the 20th century no longer just a national document, but a global beacon, a philosophical framework for oppressed peoples everywhere. Its words, originally intended to justify the separation of colonies from a king, were now deployed in the astonishing, long struggle to realize full equality within the American experiment itself. The Civil Rights Movement, cashing the promissory note. The most potent and emotional reinterpretation of the Declaration came during the Civil Rights Movement of the mid-20th century. Activists used the document's equality clause to challenge a century of legalized racial segregation and disenfranchisement. Martin Luther King Jr.'s Dream, 1963. In his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. referred to the Declaration of Independence as a promissory note to every American. He asserted that the nation had given its black citizens a check marked insufficient funds when it came to their unalienable rights. But he refused to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. His entire appeal was rooted not in new laws, but in the founders' original, magnificent promise, the guarantee that all men are created equal. This was the ultimate, astonishing realization of Lincoln's vision, using the apple of gold to force the country to live up to its creed. The power of words. The movement's moral strength came from this insistence that their demands were not radical departures, but calls for fidelity to the nation's founding charter. They were forcing America to reconcile its laws, the Constitution, which was seen to have compromises, with its moral foundation, the Declaration. The ultimate success of the movement, culminating in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, was, in a profound way, the final cashing of that 1776 promissory note. The global template, a declaration heard around the world. The influence of the Declaration of Independence was not confined to American shores. It became an astonishing global template for freedom, used by nations and movements seeking their own liberation from colonial rule or oppressive regimes. Vietnam, 1945. One of the most striking and ironic examples of its global reach occurred in 1945. When Ho Chi Minh declared the independence of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam from France, he deliberately opened his address with a passage directly quoting Jefferson's declaration. All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Ho Chi Minh used the American text as a moral weapon against the colonialism of America's French allies, demonstrating the Declaration's universal adaptability. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948. After the horrors of World War II, the United Nations sought to establish a universal standard of rights. The lead drafter of this document was Eleanor Roosevelt. Though the UN's document is more extensive, its philosophical heart, the assertion that inherent dignity and equal and unalienable rights are the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace, is a direct, astonishing descendant of the 1776 text. The American Declaration had evolved into the global conscience on human liberty. The enduring mystery, a work in progress. Today, the Declaration of Independence is no longer just a historical document, it is an active ideological force. Its ultimate power lies in its incompleteness, the profound, continuing gap between its majestic prose and the imperfect reality of the American experiment. The astonishing truth is that the document, written by a slave owner who had to remove a clause condemning slavery, remains the most powerful statement of universal human equality ever penned in the West. This inherent paradox forces every generation of Americans to confront the nation's failures and renew the demand for justice. The faded parchment. The original document is housed in the National Archives, its signatures barely visible, a physical reminder of its age and vulnerability. Its fragility emphasizes the enduring effort required to maintain the ideals it contains. The perpetual debate. Every political and social conflict, from debates over immigration and healthcare to arguments over economic inequality, can ultimately be traced back to a fundamental disagreement over the true meaning and scope of the phrase, "All men are created equal," and what constitutes the pursuit of happiness. The Declaration is thus an unfinished revolution. It is not a document of conclusion, but of perpetual commencement. It established a benchmark of liberty so high that the American experiment has been and remains a constant, astonishing struggle to reach it. It ensures that the United States will forever be held accountable not just to its laws, but to its highest, most revolutionary, and most sacred ideals.
Part 6. The Guardianship of the Relic and the Quest for Immortality.
As the 20th century closed, the story of the Declaration shifted its focus from political action to preservation science. The physical document, the very parchment that held the immortal words, became the center of an intensive, astonishing effort to ensure its survival for centuries to come. The scientific vault and the helium chamber. After the Declaration's dramatic move to the National Archives in 1952, historians and scientists realized the urgency of its condition. The combined effects of humidity, light, and centuries of rough handling had left the parchment brittle and the iron gall ink severely faded. This led to a commitment to preservation unmatched in American history. The 1980s Preservation Project. In the late 1980s, the National Archives undertook a comprehensive multi-million-dollar preservation program. The scientists realized that the original 1952 sealing process, which used glass and metal, was not fully protecting the relics. A controlled atmosphere. The astonishing solution involved creating entirely new, specially designed display cases. The air surrounding the Declaration, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights was entirely replaced with argon gas, later switched to chemically inert helium gas. This non-reactive atmosphere eliminates the threat of oxidation, which causes ink to fade and parchment to degrade. Filtering the light. The documents are displayed behind layers of specially filtered protective glass that blocks harmful ultraviolet and infrared light, ensuring that the ambient viewing light causes minimal damage. For centuries, light was the primary enemy of the ink. Today, it is precisely controlled. The ritualistic lowering. Every night, the documents are ritually lowered into a massive 55-ton vault built of steel and reinforced concrete, secured by a complex lock system. This daily closure protects the relics from the risks of fire, natural disaster, and terrorism. This daily act, performed with solemnity and precision, underscores the astonishing value the nation places on these physical symbols of its foundation. The physical declaration is no longer a political document. It is a scientific object of immense cultural value, constantly monitored and protected by a team of conservators, historians, and engineers. The Handwriting of Destiny, John Hancock's Audacity. The physical aspect of the document holds its own compelling historical astonishment, largely centered on the signatures themselves. The signing on August 2nd was a solemn yet disorganized affair. The names were eventually organized geographically by state from north to south, but the first signature was and remains the most famous. John Hancock, as President of the Continental Congress, signed his name first, boldly and extravagantly, right in the center, beneath the text. His signature, large and looping, takes up nearly a third of the designated space. The astonishing historical legacy of this signature is twofold. The legend of defiance. Legend has it that he signed it so large so that King George III could read it without his spectacles. Whether true or not, the tale perfectly encapsulates the spirit of audacious defiance that defined the moment.
Hancock's signature became the physical embodiment of treason, a declaration of personal war against the Crown. The Aramerican byword. To this day, the phrase, "Put your John Hancock here," is common American parlance for "sign your name." The name of the man who presided over the treasonous act became synonymous with the act of authorization itself, a remarkable cultural transformation that cemented his place in the American lexicon. The unending debate, the Constitution versus the Declaration. The final astonishing element of the Declaration is its role in the perpetual philosophical tug-of-war within American governance. In American legal and political thought, there are two founding documents: the Constitution, the document of law, which defines how the government works, its structure, and its limitations. It is pragmatic, procedural, and designed for stability. The Declaration, the document of aspiration, which defines why the government exists and what its ultimate moral purpose must be. It is philosophical, revolutionary, and designed for change. The entire astonishing narrative of American political history can be viewed as the struggle between these two texts, the constant effort to reconcile the pragmatic, often compromised framework of the Constitution with the revolutionary, uncompromising idealism of the Declaration. The Declaration's "all men are created equal" ensures that the American political system can never settle into permanent complacency. It provides the moral leverage necessary for every generation to challenge existing power structures and laws that fail to meet the standard of universal human rights. This is the ultimate legacy of the Declaration of Independence. It did not just create a nation, it created an eternal revolutionary impulse. It is a perpetual mandate for justice, a work in progress, and the enduring source of both America's greatest shame and its most astonishing hope.
Part 7. The Unfolding Legacy in Law and Letters. The story of the Declaration of Independence did not conclude with the Civil Rights Movement or the safeguarding of the physical parchment. Its most potent and ongoing function lies in its role as a source of fundamental American values, invoked in the highest courts and debated by the nation's most influential thinkers. The document remains a powerful, astonishing touchstone in American law and letters. The Supreme Court and the Shadow of 1776. The Declaration is not technically a law, and its text is not directly enforceable by courts in the way the Constitution is. Yet its spirit and its core principles have repeatedly cast a defining shadow over Supreme Court jurisprudence, ensuring that the law is constantly measured against the ideal. The Privileges and Immunities Clause. While the original Constitution contained compromises, the Declaration's principle of equality was formally infused into the supreme law after the Civil War. The 14th Amendment, 1868, particularly its Equal Protection Clause and its guarantee of due process and privileges or immunities, is understood by many scholars as the ultimate legal enforcement of the Declaration's promise. When the Supreme Court strikes down discriminatory laws, it is arguably giving the Declaration its legal teeth. The concept of inherent rights. The Declaration's insistence on
unalienable rights that are inherent to humanity, given by the Creator, not by the government, has influenced judicial philosophy. In cases concerning fundamental liberties like privacy or marriage, justices often refer back to the spirit of the Declaration to justify the existence of rights not explicitly enumerated in the Bill of Rights. This astonishing use allows the 1776 text to continue shaping modern American liberties, arguing that the government exists to protect, not grant, these fundamental human dignities. The forgotten voices, the ladies of the Revolution. The astonishing story of the Declaration is incomplete without acknowledging the countless voices, particularly women, who supported, sacrificed for, and eventually expanded upon its ideals. While they had no vote and no voice in the drafting room, their actions ensured the Declaration's success. Abigail Adams' astonishing warning, 1776. As John Adams championed independence in Philadelphia, his wife Abigail managed their farm and raised their children. Her letters to her husband are among the most insightful records of the era. She famously urged him to remember the ladies in the new code of laws, warning that if particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. Her letter, though initially dismissed by John with amusement, was a profound early feminist declaration rooted in the very spirit of the Declaration of Independence, the right to self-government. The Daughters of Liberty. Across the colonies, women formed groups that enforced boycotts of British goods, spun clothes to replace British imports, the spinning bees, raised money for the Continental Army, and even acted as spies. They were the essential infrastructure of the Revolution, demonstrating that the pursuit of liberty was a collective domestic effort that extended far beyond the walls of the State House. The enduring mystery of the drafts. Finally, the Declaration's story continues in the painstaking effort to understand its evolution. Historians and conservators continually study the surviving drafts to understand the founders' shifting intentions and ongoing academic astonishment. Jefferson's original rough draft, the surviving early draft in Jefferson's hand, with corrections by Adams and Franklin, offers a powerful, tangible glimpse into the compromise that birthed the nation. The visible ink marks showing the removal of the anti-slavery clause serve as a perpetual painful reminder of the nation's original sin and the magnitude of the promise left unfulfilled. The language of grievance. The final portion of the Declaration, the long list of grievances against King George III, is often skipped over today. Yet, it was, at the time, the most politically crucial part. It transformed the Revolution from a chaotic rebellion to a measured, justified, legal and historical act, detailing the king's alleged tyranny. It was, astonishingly, a lawyer's brief written to sway the court of global opinion, particularly the French crown. The Declaration of Independence is not a relic on a pedestal, but a living, astonishing document whose principles are continually refined, debated, and fought over. It is the ultimate expression of the idea that America is not defined by its history, but by its aspiration, a promise for freedom that even 250 years later remains the country's most powerful, unifying, and unfinished work.
Part 8. The Final Astonishment, Global Resonance and the Future of the Creed. The final chapter in the Declaration's continuous story is its role as the philosophical bedrock for global democracy, and its capacity to inspire the creation of entirely new nations. It exists today as both a source of pride and a profound challenge to modern American life. The transatlantic power of ideas. The intellectual influence of the Declaration was perhaps most astonishing in its direct effect on the French Revolution. Lafayette and the Declaration of the Rights of Man. The Marquis de Lafayette, the French hero who fought alongside Washington, was so profoundly inspired by the American Declaration that he brought its principles home to France. Working closely with Jefferson, who was serving as the U.S. Minister to France in 1789, Lafayette drafted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. This document, which ignited the French Revolution, borrowed heavily from Jefferson's text, proclaiming that men are born and remain free in rights, and that the goal of all political association is the preservation of these natural and imprescriptible rights. A global ideological split. The Declaration of Independence did more than secure a military alliance. It demonstrated that Enlightenment ideas, liberty, equality, and popular sovereignty could be codified and enforced in a successful revolution. This established a deep, astonishing fissure in global governance. The old world of monarchy versus the new world of republicanism. The Declaration in the digital age. The astonishing journey of the Declaration has now led it into the digital realm, transforming how the public interacts with this foundational text. Accessibility and preservation. The National Archives now provides high-resolution digital scans and searchable transcripts of the original documents, ensuring that every citizen has immediate, detailed access to the text. This digital guardianship means the Declaration is simultaneously secured in a helium vault and infinitely replicated across the Internet, a powerful modern paradox of preservation. Continuous re-evaluation. In the digital public square, the Declaration's inherent paradoxes, the gap between the ideal of equality and the reality of the signer's slave ownership, are constantly debated and re-evaluated with astonishing speed and depth. Scholars and citizens use the document to question systemic inequality, arguing that the idea of equality must always transcend the historical flaws of the authors. The document has thus become a primary text for understanding American identity and confronting its historical failures. The personalization of pursuit. The concept of the pursuit of happiness is arguably the Declaration's most enduring gift to the American psyche. It is a phrase unique to this document, replacing John Locke's property. A psychological foundation. This phrase cemented the idea that the American government is primarily concerned with creating the conditions under which individuals can define and seek their own fulfillment, their own personal vision of success and well-being. It is the philosophical underpinning of the American dream, the belief in upward mobility and individual potential. The unending quest. The word pursuit is the key. The Declaration does not promise happiness, it guarantees the right to seek it. This simple semantic choice defines the American experience as one of perpetual effort, restlessness, and individualism. It is an acknowledgement that the most important life goal is a personal, lifelong quest. The astonishing truth is that the document, forged in a single desperate moment of treason in 1776, provided the intellectual, moral, and psychological framework for an entire nation. It remains the most powerful expression of American idealism, continually forcing the country toward a more just, more equal, and more astonishing future. In conclusion, the story of the Declaration of Independence is a 100,000-word narrative of collective courage, political compromise, diplomatic genius, spiritual redemption, and endless legal and moral struggle. It began as a death warrant for 56 men and concluded as the foundational creed for global democracy. Its ultimate astonishing power lies in its capacity to serve as both the nation's historical record and its perpetual promise. The Declaration is not merely history, it is destiny, always pointing toward the more perfect union that America is still pursuing.
Part 9. The Shadows and Silences. Native Americans and the Declaration. To fully appreciate the astonishing scope and complexity of the Declaration of Independence, one must confront its profound silences and its darker passages. Specifically, its relationship with Native American populations. For while the document championed freedom for colonists, it simultaneously categorized indigenous peoples in a way that justified ongoing conflict and land seizure. The grievance that echoes tragedy. Amidst the long list of grievances against King George III, taxation without consent, military occupation, and suppression of colonial legislatures, one astonishing and often overlooked clause stands out for its chilling implication regarding Native Americans. He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us, and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. A political tool. This inclusion was primarily a political tactic. The colonists were accusing the king of utilizing Native American tribes,
who often allied with the British in hopes of stopping the relentless westward expansion of settlers, as military pawns. The term merciless Indian savages served to dehumanize indigenous peoples, justifying military action against them and appealing to the colonists' deepest frontier fears. Exclusion from the creed. The phrase, "all men are created equal," was clearly not intended, at that time, to apply to Native Americans. By characterizing them as savages whose known rule of warfare was an undistinguished destruction, the Declaration placed them outside the boundaries of civilized governance and the unalienable rights it was declaring. The irony of sovereignty. The Declaration asserted the American colonists' right to national sovereignty. Yet the same document was used by the nascent government to deny the inherent sovereignty of the existing indigenous nations. This astonishing contradiction is central to understanding the hypocrisy baked into the founding principles. Liberty for one group necessitated the denial of liberty for others. The proclamation line and the roots of conflict. The conflict that led to this aggressive language was not new. One of the major, often forgotten irritants leading to the Revolution was the British Proclamation of 1763. The King's Restriction. After the French and Indian War, the king decreed that colonial settlement was forbidden west of the Appalachian Mountains. The king's goal was twofold: to prevent expensive, bloody wars with powerful Western Native American confederacies, like those led by Pontiac, and to regulate the pace of westward expansion. Colonial outrage. To the colonists, especially wealthy land speculators like George Washington and Patrick Henry, this restriction was seen as an intolerable denial of their right to seize and develop new territory. Thus, one of the hidden motivations for the Declaration of Independence was the desire to remove the British barrier to the seizure of Native American lands. The removal of the British, celebrated as an act of liberty, immediately unleashed the full, violent force of American expansion upon indigenous nations. A continuing struggle for recognition. The Declaration's silence on the rights of Native Americans and its actively hostile language toward them initiated a struggle for political recognition that continues today. Sovereignty versus citizenship. Unlike the enslaved people whose descendants eventually fought for the enforcement of the "all men are created equal" clause, Native Americans' primary fight was not for equality within the American system, but for the recognition of their distinct, pre-existing sovereignty. Their struggle focused on treaty rights, self-governments, and cultural survival. The Indian Citizenship Act of 1924. It took nearly 150 years after the Declaration for Congress to pass the Indian Citizenship Act, granting full U.S. citizenship to all Native Americans born in the United States. Even then, many states continued to deny them the right to vote for decades longer. The astonishing historical truth is that the promise of the Declaration was built upon a foundation of profound exclusion. To fully grasp the document's magnitude, one must recognize that its high ideals were used to create a government that simultaneously oppressed, marginalized, and nearly extinguished the populations that already inhabited the continent. The ongoing effort to achieve reconciliation, honor treaty obligations, and recognize tribal sovereignty is the ultimate modern test of whether the Declaration's creed of liberty can ever truly be universalized, transcending the dark intentions of its original authors and the tragic historical consequences of its most exclusive clause.
Part X: The Perpetual Ideal and the American Future. The journey of the Declaration of Independence concludes not as a closed book, but as an endlessly unfolding philosophical and moral challenge. The final astonishing element of its story is its continued use as a tool for self-critique and a vision for the American future. The Constitution and the Declaration, an unbreakable tension. In modern American life, the Declaration operates in an astonishing constant tension with the Constitution. This tension is, by design, the engine of American progress. The Constitution, with its system of checks and balances, its compromises, and its detailed rules on governance, represents the nation's commitment to order and stability. It is the practical framework. The Declaration as idealism. The Declaration, with its soaring language of equality and unalienable rights, represents the nation's commitment to justice and change. It is the moral purpose. This ideological clash ensures that the nation is never allowed to rest content with its existing laws. The civil rights movement, the women's suffrage movement, and the modern LGBTQ+ rights movement were all fundamentally arguments appealing from the practical framework of the Constitution back to the lofty ideal of the Declaration. They argued that if all men are created equal, then existing laws that deny rights based on race, sex, or orientation are fundamentally un-American according to the nation's foundational creed. The Declaration therefore functions as a perpetual ought against the Constitution's is. The astonishing resilience of the idea. The 100,000-word story of the Declaration is ultimately a testament to the resilience of a single, simple idea born in a hot, crowded room in 1776, that legitimate governance must be derived from the consent of the governed, and that the protection of universal human rights is the reason governments exist. The power of words over men. The document has long since surpassed the fallible men who wrote and signed it. The personal flaws of Thomas Jefferson, his slave ownership, John Adams, his elitism, and the many signers who suffered financial ruin are now secondary to the power of the principles they articulated. The ideal of equality achieved a life independent of its authors, a profound and astonishing intellectual escape. A call to perpetual revolution.
The Declaration is a document that justifies revolution by stating that governments derive their just powers from consent and that people have a right to alter or abolish a destructive government. It instills a permanent skepticism toward authority. This critical spirit is the core of American liberty. The astonishing freedom to criticize, dissent, and continually advocate for radical change in pursuit of the ideal. The final charge. The most astonishing truth of the Declaration of Independence is that it set a moral standard that no society, including the United States, has ever fully met. Yet, this failure is precisely what gives the document its continuing power. It is a promise inherited by every generation, a covenant with the future, to keep fighting for the realization of a society where the inherent dignity and equality of every person are not merely words on paper, but the lived, tangible reality of the American experience. The Declaration's story is the story of America's ceaseless, magnificent, and often failed attempt to become what it declared itself to be on July 4th, 1776. The end of the narrative.
If you enjoyed this astonishing, fact-filled, and mysterious historical journey, please give us a like. Our mission is to bring forth the mysterious, historical, and astonishing truths that may have been overlooked or incorrectly taught in traditional accounts. We uncover the realities that are often missing from standard history books. If you don't want to miss out on these kinds of historical, mysterious, and mind-boggling truths, then be sure to subscribe to our channel now.